Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My guest today is medieval history professor Corinne Wieben from Colorado. And today with Corinne, we'll talk about Halloween, its history and its traditions. And Corinne is also an expert in all these ancient matters and also about witchcraft, which is somehow connected to Halloween. We will cover it all during this discussion. Thanks for your time, Corinne. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, would you like to tell me and my viewers something about yourself and about your background because you're also a podcaster. So
Yeah,
yeah. So you can introduce you the way you want.
sure. On top of being a professor of medieval and Renaissance history, I'm also the host and producer of the podcast Enchanted, the History of Magic and Witchcraft. So that is my connection to all things magical.
Yeah, and I'll add to the description to this video the link to your podcast so that my viewers can. I don't know if I should say take a look at a podcast, but listen to it. And it's fantastic. It's very well done. And it's very interesting. I listen to it every time a new episode comes out. So I'm very familiar with it, and it's very well done.
Oh, that's very flattering. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. So let's start from the basics. Can you explain us in a nutshell what the history of Halloween is?
Sure. In a nutshell is hard, but it's a very ancient holiday. It probably has roots in an ancient Celtic festival, sort of celebrating the harvest season, the end of summer and fall, and the beginning of winter. So it's a time associated with increasing darkness, with death, and with thinning the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead. The Celts believed during this period spirits could more easily cross into the mortal realm. Then, with the advent of Christianity, by about the 9th century, the church established All Saints' Day, also called All Hallows' Day on November 1st. And so the evening before became All Hallows' Eve or Halloween.
Well, and how was it in the very beginning? Meaning here, what of the things that they used to do in Ireland, if I get it correctly, are we still doing today for Halloween?
Yeah, so a lot of the traditions that we have in modern Halloween were brought largely to the United States by Irish and Scottish immigrants. Things like trick-or-treating or carving jack-o'-lanterns or even wearing costumes are all traditions that have old roots in the United Kingdom and in Ireland. So I think a lot of the rituals that still exist, I think the most famous is wearing costumes, and that's also kind of traced back to those Celtic roots of wearing costumes or disguising yourself during this season, during Samhain, this kind of harvest holiday. And part of that was to blend in with supernatural beings so they don't mark you out as human and try to attack you. So it was part of keeping yourself kind of spiritually safe. But now, obviously costumes are about creativity and fun and festivity. Uh, we also see some other traditions, though, in other cultures. For example, Mexico has Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, which also coincides with Halloween, where people continue to honor their ancestors with altars and offerings, wearing costumes, having parades. There's also a tradition, also part of the Celtic holiday of Samhain, which is lighting bonfires. And at least in the UK, this still exists as the practice of bonfire night, which is usually, I think, November 5th. But still, that idea of light and lighting fires to ward off evil spirits still has echoes.
So can you elaborate a little bit on where things such as the Jacko Lantern or the trick or treat come from?
Yes. So again, the modern practice of jack-o'-lanterns goes back to those Celtic rituals. Originally, the Celts carved turnips and put candles inside to ward off malevolent spirits. But the practice evolved when Irish immigrants came to America. They found pumpkins, which are a North American crop, and decided it was much easier to carve a pumpkin and you can put bigger candles in there. So we got the modern jack-o'-lantern from that. There's a 19th century story that kind of captures this tradition from England. It's the story of Stingy Jack. Do you know this story at all?
I don't.
It's a fun piece of folklore. So this is a man who tricks the devil into not being able to take his soul, but he lives this kind of degenerate life. And so when he dies, he tries to go to heaven, and heaven won't take him because of his terrible sins. Then he tries to go to hell, but the devil can't take him because they already made this deal. So the devil gives him a carved turnip with an ember in it, and he's forced to use that as a lantern to walk, which is where we get the word Jack o' Lantern. So that becomes the story as he kind of wanders the earth, especially on Halloween, with it's lit by this lantern.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Trick
And
or
yeah.
treating probably also has origins in the United Kingdom and England, Scotland, and Ireland. Um, in medieval England, on All Souls Day, they had a tradition called souling, which people would go door to door and offer to say prayers in exchange for food, usually small cakes. And so that practice was thought to help the souls of the departed find peace. And in return for the food, the soulers would offer prayers. And during not just Halloween, but Christmas, in England, there was also a tradition of mumming where people would dress up in costumes, sing songs, or do short theatrical pieces in exchange for food or drink, going from door to door. So those probably slowly evolved into the idea of wearing costumes and then going door to door and asking for treats.
Yeah, but nowadays Halloween is also often associated with horror. For instance, I got my Halloween dress and it's a ghost face from the Scream
Yes.
movie. Yeah, so this is what you do these days, okay? It's either Freddy Krueger or Ghostface or Michael Myers. Where does the association between Halloween and horror come from?
Yes. So obviously, from its beginning, from the Celtic festival of Samhain, uh, Halloween's association with death and the supernatural has kind of always been there. So it's always been associated with the dangerous and the unpredictable and the supernatural. So part of those practices, lighting bonfires or wearing disguises, performing rituals to honor dead ancestors, are all kind of part of that idea of keeping ourselves safe from the supernatural dangers of the holiday. And I think over time, Halloween became a time for storytelling, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, with the advent of Gothic novels and Gothic horror. That Halloween became the season for telling chilling ghost stories. Writers like Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, and Edgar Allan Poe, famous for The Fall of the House of Usher and The Telltale Heart, create these stories that specifically focus on themes of death and madness and terror. So that contributed, I think, to this growing cultural fascination with horror, especially during the season of Halloween. And then, of course, in the 20th century, Hollywood kind of solidifies Halloween as the moment for horror films. We get haunted houses and ghosts and vampires and zombies, all become staples of not just film, but now Halloween decorations, costumes. We've kind of begun to associate Halloween around these associations that I think film has really given us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the case. And Halloween is also often associated with witchcraft. Can you explain us how witchcraft shaped the modern images or imaginary of Halloween?
Yeah, for that we get to blame early modern Europe. So
Okay,
as we do with so many things.
point
Uh,
taken.
yeah, yeah, yeah. In the Middle Ages, fears about witches sort of existed, but they weren't widespread. They weren't large cultural things. It's really in the 15th through the 18th centuries that we start to see the rise of anxieties about witchcraft and what's sometimes termed the witch craze, that uh, big explosion of witch trials that we see in Europe. And that really set the foundation for witches as these dark, ominous figures in pop culture. Early woodcuts and portrayals of witches usually show them with the iconic pointed hats and brooms and cauldrons, all these things that we associate with witchcraft and witches now. And then, of course, we have literature like Shakespeare's Macbeth or Goethe's Faust, which depict witches as mysterious and shadowy figures often associated with death. So I think that is kind of what gives us the stereotype of the witch. And then with the rise of Halloween as a holiday for costumes and parties, especially in the US, witch costumes become popularized and they kind of draw on those exaggerated features like crooked noses and green skin. And then, of course, films like The Wizard of Oz and Hocus Pocus kind of show us what witches are supposed to look like. But that's actually starting to change in recent decades, especially with the rise of Wicca and neo-pagan traditions. Witches and witchcraft are kind of being rehabilitated in our cultural imagination, and we're starting to, I think, get more nuanced images of witches now.
Okay, leave the history alone and let's focus about the current day's Halloween now. What are the differences between Halloween, how it's celebrated in big cities, say New York, LA, or those places, and in the countryside? Because I've never been actually in America during the night of Halloween. I remember once I was there in the fall, but I left on October 31st, so I could not actually take part to the festivity itself. But I think that it's quite different being in the countryside or being in a big city. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think big cities often kind of take advantage of their urban setting. They have big Halloween parades and festivals, big elaborate events like haunted houses or themed concerts. And so I think the celebrations tend to be kind of bigger, but a little more impersonal. Uh, on the other hand, when it comes to actually celebrating Halloween among families, in cities, children might be restricted to just their neighborhood or even their apartment complex, rather than just being able to kind of wander around. And I think the opposite is true in smaller communities. You start to get more community-oriented things. Families kind of let their children wander to trick or treat, feeling it's a little bit safer. And you tend to get kind of more traditional things like hay rides and small haunted houses and small Halloween parties. So I think they're very different just based on kind of the geography of cities versus smaller communities.
There's okay, so let me phrase it properly. So in Italy, we have a culture that is pretty monolithic. So the Italians are not used to different cultures. Okay. So for instance, basically most of the Italians mistake like religion for Christianity and Christianity for Catholicism. Okay. So we're not open to different cultures. And we have this misconception among old school Italians, and I'm saying it here in a negative way, of course, according to which Halloween is somehow anti-Christian because it celebrates death and fear and something of the sort, and because it overlaps with a Christian festivity. Can we rule out that once and for all?
Yeah, I think so. And of course, that's not just an Italian phenomenon. We have the same thing here in the United States. There are certain Christians, certain, especially conservative Christians, who also don't like Halloween because they think it's somehow evil or anti-Christian. And of course, Halloween has pre-Christian roots. And so even early on, I think as Christianity spread, there was sometimes a tension between uh, authorities who wanted people to just adopt it as All Saints' Day, rather than kind of celebrate these older traditions. But I think that was never perceived as somehow anti-Christian. It was just sort of seen as old-fashioned. Uh, and I think one of the things that causes some people anxiety is because Halloween often uses symbols associated with death and the supernatural, ghosts and skeletons and witches. which can seem dark or evil to some. But I think these elements are usually part of the holiday's playful spookiness, not endorsements of evil or in any way anti-Christian. And especially I think by now Halloween has really evolved into a secular holiday for most people, especially in Western countries. We focus on costumes and trick-or-treating and community gatherings. There's really nothing religious in any sense about that. Its association with the supernatural is, I think, more about acknowledging human curiosity about mortality and the afterlife, right? Which are concepts that are compatible with a variety of different religious beliefs, I think, including Christianity.
Okay, it makes me feel better knowing that it's not just an Italian phenomenon, that close-minded people exist everywhere. But is it something recent, or is this Halloween scare was this Halloween scare also there like 50 years ago, or is it something recent?
So to talk about this, I'm going to talk a little bit about horror movies,
Sure.
because I'm dying to talk about that too. And you mentioned
Absolutely. Feel
you're
free.
dressing as Ghostface. So, I mean, so obviously as Christianity spread early on, early Christian leaders kind of adapted pre-Christian traditions into All Hallows Eve. But by the 20th century, especially during the 1970s and 80s, in the United States, there was a kind of moral panic around Halloween. And it wasn't just Halloween, there was a moral panic around lots of things. But concerns really focused on supposed dangers to children, like urban legends about poisoned or tampered with Halloween candy, even though there's no evidence or very little evidence of that ever happening. This kind of creates this larger anxiety about Halloween. This also ties into what's sometimes termed the satanic panic of the 1980s, this fear that there are these cults somewhere in the United States that are kind of working on occult practices and witchcraft and evil things. Um, and really, although certain religious groups have still kind of hung on to those anxieties, I think for the most part we've kind of let go of that moral panic by now. So it has always kind of been there, but it seems to have really peaked in the 1970s and 80s. And I think one of the questions we kind of talked about earlier was the shift from traditional monsters in film to kind of modern horror icons like Freddy Krueger and Ghostface.
Yeah.
And I think that is also tied to some of these anxieties. So in the early 20th century in film, we've got monsters like Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman. And I think they really symbolized societal fears and cultural anxieties around science or the unknown or kind of foreign others. And by the time we get to the late 20th century, those societal fears have evolved. The new horror icons reflect contemporary anxieties like psychopathic killers or environmental threats. And I think that that also kind of ties into the moral panic of the 70s and 80s. Uh, it's really in the 70s and 80s that we get films like Halloween and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street that popularize that slasher genre and these new kinds of horror icons. And it really seems to come out of the blue if you're just looking at Hollywood, if you just look at the US. But if you look at Italy, right
Yeah.
before that shift, right in the 1960s, we have the era of Giallo and the Giallo films and Dario Argento. And those films often feature mysterious killers, often with hidden identities. They're often masked, and they've got these kind of unusual, iconic weapons that they're using to do violence. And lo and behold, those films come out, and then a decade later, Hollywood is producing Halloween and Friday the 13th. So we get Michael Myers, Jason, Freddy Krueger, these masked or disfigured killers who have these iconic, strange weapons. So I think a lot of that comes out of giallo, but I think, especially in the US, that also kind of reflects these anxieties in the 70s and 80s from an increasingly urban population as people move out of small communities and into cities. I think worries about anonymous violence become much more common. And that, I think, also starts to weave into these anxieties about Halloween and anything that might symbolize evil.
That's a very good point. And it might surprise you that I'm a big fan of all the Hollywood movies, but I hate all the Italian ones because, yeah, all the giallos from the 70s and the 60s, to me, they are so dumb and extremely violent
Yeah.
because I think that the violence is there like to fill in the gaps of ideas because there are no ideas. Most of them are just violence and that's it. You just get 2 hours of blood and arms being thrown apart and that's about it. While the American movies have a concept and they have some tension. So it surprises everybody that I'm an Italian slasher movie lovers, but I hate all the Italian movies. Someone says that Freddy Krueger was inspired by a movie by Lamberto Bava. I don't even remember the name. I think it has the Castello di Norimberga in the title. I watched that movie and it was so horrible. It was so boring that I really don't think that Wes Craven took his inspiration from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that Hollywood shoots those films, things like camera angles, lighting, costuming, those tend to be taken from giallo, but I think you're right. I think that the plots, the stories, even the type of character are very much American products.
Yeah, for instance, if you watch A Nightmare on Elm Street, especially the first one, you have a plot, okay? And the scary thing about A Nightmare on Elm Street is that it makes no sense. Like having the bedroom rolled upside down makes no sense. That's what scares the viewers. While the Italian movies, of course, didn't have the budget to do any of that, but it's just violence, violence, and violence, and blood, and arms being thrown apart. So I hate those movies, and it's kind of surprising that I'm Italian and I say so. You mentioned urban legends connected to Halloween, for instance, Blade concealed into candies, and there's no evidence of that ever happening. It's probably just a urban legend. Can you think of other urban legend of the sort?
Yes. Yeah, there are lots. I can only really speak to the American ones. I don't know if these exist too in Italy, but I know in the US, a lot of people believe that Halloween is a night where criminal activity is heightened. There's a lot more crime or a lot more violence, and that's actually not true. There's minor vandalism sometimes, but that seems to be the limit of it. There's no spike in any other kind of crime. And yet it still kind of has that reputation. There's also a kind of long-standing cultural belief that Halloween decorations or costumes might attract bad luck or harbor evil spirits. So much so that there have been episodes of television shows. Back in the 90s, we had a television series called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yeah, in one of the episodes, everyone who is dressed in a Halloween costume magically becomes the thing they're dressed as. So it like obviously that cultural idea is so deeply rooted that we can just make reference to it and it makes sense. So there's also that. There's also some people think that Halloween always falls on a full moon, which is strange because we have a solar calendar, so that
It's
cannot physically
impossible.
happen. Yeah.
It's impossible. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very cool when it does, but yeah, no, very rarely is there a full moon on Halloween. So yeah, there are still kind of these weird beliefs that kind of float in our culture without really being examined or analyzed. And I think that has to do with those ancient roots of Halloween as this time of uncertainty and possible anxiety.
Okay, so I might become Ghostface in a few days if that
I mean, there
happens.
are worse things.
If that happens, I'll reach out and let you know. I was wondering, so Halloween has been popular in Italy for the last, say, 20 years or so, but I think that before getting like here to Southern Europe, I think it spread to English-speaking countries because of cultural closeness. It was easier. So I'm thinking to myself here, how different is Halloween, say, in the US or in Australia or even in Jamaica? Because one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that also the weather is much different because we are used in the West to having Halloween in the fall, but for instance, in Australia, it's spring. And in Jamaica, it's pretty much summer all year long. So I was wondering what the differences are.
Yeah, in general, Halloween outside of the US tends to combine, if there are local traditions, tends to kind of fold those in with a lot of elements of American influence. I think the US has kind of colonized Halloween, as we will do, and sort of spread that. Halloween traditions, for example, in Canada, elsewhere in North America, are very similar to those in the US, including trick-or-treating, costumes, decorations. And some areas tend to also incorporate things like local folklore or other seasonal autumn traditions into it. But it's very similar to how we celebrate it in America. Halloween in the UK has used to be a little bit more traditional, things like, small parties and apple bobbing and these kind
Mhm.
of older traditions. Now it's become more similar to American style celebrations. And again, I think a lot of that is kind of America's relentless cultural spread as especially younger people have started to do things like start trick-or-treating, wearing costumes, having these like big Halloween parties. Um, and again, traditionally, the UK actually used to focus more on Bonfire Night, which is a little bit later, November 5th. And Halloween was a lesser known event until American influence began to grow. Um, Ireland, again, because of that Celtic root and that Celtic tradition, um, always has kind of celebrated Halloween. Celebrations continue to include bonfires, traditional games, storytelling. Trick-or-treating is also starting to become popular. Um, in places like Australia and New Zealand, I think Halloween is still relatively uncelebrated, relatively low key. Maybe in urban areas, some people celebrate it. But I think it's still very much seen as an American holiday. And same thing in English speaking Caribbean countries. I know Jamaica, for instance, has sometimes Halloween parties and Halloween celebrations, but it's still very much seen as like an American import.
Okay, so the last thing we can say to my viewers is have fun and don't be worried. There's nothing evil about it. Just have fun.
Yeah, definitely have fun. Yeah, don't worry that you will turn into the thing you dress up as.
That won't happen. Well, Corinne, many thanks for your time. I think that your explanations were very precise and precious, and I think they shed a lot of light on this topic that is widely unknown in Italy because people celebrate, but actually they didn't know what they are celebrating. So I think that giving some explanations can do good to a lot of people.
Excellent. Yeah, hopefully it enriches everybody's experience of the holiday.
And of course, I look forward to having you here a second time. Maybe we talk about witchcraft the next time.
Excellent. Happy to talk about witches in Italy.
Yeah, okay, that would be great. Yeah, the Befana, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's just one of them. Thanks everybody else for watching this video and see you all next time. Bye bye.